A pair of torn shoes sat outside the principal's office. They were so worn that the soles had been stitched together with fishing line, and when the boy wearing them stood up, one shoe nearly slipped off his foot. Most people didn't notice because they were too busy talking about him instead. Another week of absences. He never brings his books. His fees are months overdue. He's wasting everyone's time. At just 16 years old, Daniel had already become the student everyone believed they understood. Teachers called him careless. Classmates whispered that he was lazy. Parents complained that students like him lowered the school's standards. Nobody asked why he always arrived exhausted, why he never joined lunch breaks, or why he disappeared the moment the final bell rang. That morning, the principal placed a thin file on the desk and folded his hands. "I'm afraid we can't keep making exceptions," he said. "Without payment and regular attendance, you'll have to leave school." Daniel lowered his eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. It wasn't pride that kept him silent. It was exhaustion. Some battles become too familiar to fight. As he reached for his faded backpack, something slipped onto the office floor. It wasn't money. It wasn't homework. It was a tiny photograph of a smiling woman holding the hand of a much younger Daniel. The edges were faded, as though it had been unfolded hundreds of times. He quickly picked it up and carefully brushed invisible dust from it before slipping it back into his pocket. Most people would have ignored such a small gesture, but someone had already noticed. Standing quietly across the hallway, Mrs. Evelyn Carter wasn't looking at the photograph itself. She was watching the way Daniel protected it, almost as if it were the last precious thing he had left in the world. That wasn't the behavior of a careless boy. It was the behavior of someone carrying a pain nobody else could see. As Daniel walked away, the whispers began again. He'll never finish school. Some people simply don't want a better life. Mrs. Carter remained standing outside her classroom, thinking. For months she had watched Daniel arrive late, struggle to stay awake during lessons, and disappear before anyone could speak to him. Every explanation others offered sounded convenient, but none of them felt right. There was something different about him. Whenever she asked a difficult question in class, his tired eyes suddenly lit up. He answered with remarkable intelligence, then immediately returned to silence before anyone paid attention. A student without ability doesn't hide brilliance. A student hiding pain often does. Later that afternoon, while the school slowly emptied, Mrs. Carter found Daniel sitting alone in the library, carefully copying entire textbook chapters by hand. "You know you can borrow the book," she said softly. Daniel froze. After a long silence, he quietly replied, "I have to return home before dark." It sounded like an ordinary sentence, yet the hesitation before the word home made something inside Mrs. Carter feel uneasy. He shut the notebook almost instantly, as though he was terrified someone might discover the truth hidden between its pages. She didn't ask another question. She simply watched him walk through the school gate. Instead of turning toward the neighborhood where the other students lived, Daniel headed toward the abandoned warehouses beyond the railway tracks. Most people would never have noticed. Mrs. Carter did. And in that single moment, she realized the story everyone believed about Daniel might be completely wrong. So the next morning, instead of preparing another warning letter, she quietly made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Mrs. Carter kept her distance the next afternoon, careful not to let Daniel notice she was following him. When the last school bell rang, hundreds of students rushed toward waiting parents, buses, and warm homes. Daniel walked alone. He passed busy streets, ignored the smell of fresh food drifting from nearby restaurants, and eventually disappeared behind a row of abandoned warehouses near the railway tracks. Hidden behind a broken concrete wall, Mrs. Carter watched as he pulled a small piece of cardboard from a corner, spread it across the dusty floor, and carefully placed his backpack beneath his head as though he had done it 1,000 times before. There was no family waiting for him. No electricity. No dinner cooking in the kitchen. That abandoned building was his home. The following morning, before sunrise, Daniel folded the cardboard, washed his face with water from a public tap, straightened his wrinkled school uniform as neatly as he could, and walked to school pretending everything was normal. During lunch break, while other students laughed together, he quietly searched behind a nearby bakery for bread that had been thrown away at closing time the night before. Some days he was lucky enough to find a few pieces that were still edible. Other days, he simply drank water and told himself hunger could wait until tomorrow. Every evening after school he carried heavy boxes at a local market, swept small shops, or unloaded delivery trucks for a few dollars, never earning enough to escape poverty but always earning just enough to survive one more day. The exhaustion followed him into the classroom, where classmates laughed whenever he struggled to stay awake. "Maybe if you stopped being lazy, you'd actually pass your exams," one boy mocked, while others quietly agreed. None of them knew he had already been awake for nearly 18 hours. Yet despite everything, Daniel refused to let go of his dream. Every spare minute was spent reading borrowed books, copying notes by hand, and solving old exam papers under the dim light of a broken street lamp because he had nowhere else to study. His circumstances stole his comfort, but they never stole his determination. From a distance, Mrs. Carter began seeing the truth piece by piece, and with every painful discovery, one question became impossible to ignore. If this boy had fought so hard just to stay in school, who had been fighting for him all this time? Mrs. Evelyn Carter had spent nearly 25 years teaching, and during that time she had learned something no textbook could ever explain: children almost never lied with their actions. Adults often listened only to words, but she had built her career by paying attention to the quiet details everyone else ignored. Daniel never complained, never asked for sympathy, and never made excuses. Instead, he apologized for arriving late even when he looked too exhausted to stand. He thanked the cafeteria staff even on the days he walked away without food. He returned every borrowed pencil sharpened and every library book in better condition than he had received it. None of that matched the image of the lazy, irresponsible student everyone insisted he was. While other teachers discussed punishment, Mrs. Carter chose observation. She quietly checked attendance records and noticed his absences almost always came after heavy rain, the coldest nights, or weekends. She spoke with the school librarian, who revealed Daniel was always the last student to leave because he spent hours studying there every afternoon. The janitor mentioned finding him cleaning empty classrooms without being asked. Even the security guard admitted the boy often arrived before sunrise, sitting silently outside the locked school gates with a book in his hands. Piece by piece, the story everyone believed began to fall apart. When Mrs. Carter finally asked the administration if anyone had ever visited Daniel's home, the room fell silent. There was no home visit. No welfare check. No investigation. Only assumptions written into reports by people who had never looked beyond his worn uniform. "Our responsibility is education," one administrator replied. "We can't solve every student's personal problems." Mrs. Carter nodded politely, but deep inside, those words stayed with her. She had become a teacher because she believed education started long before textbooks and exams. Sometimes the lesson a child needed most was knowing that at least one adult refused to give up on them. That evening she returned home unable to stop thinking about Daniel's empty eyes and quiet determination. For the first time in years, she placed another person's problems ahead of her own. She knew helping him would not be simple. It might even create conflict with the school itself. But she had already made one decision she couldn't take back. She wasn't going to wait for someone else to save Daniel. She was going to find out exactly what he needed, even if it meant changing both of their lives forever. The opportunity came sooner than Mrs. Carter expected. One cold evening, heavy rain began pouring just as school ended. Most students hurried into waiting cars or ran toward nearby bus stops, but Daniel simply stood beneath the school entrance, watching everyone leave. Nearly an hour passed before he quietly started walking into the storm. Something told Mrs. Carter to follow once more. She kept her distance as he crossed flooded streets, passed neighborhoods filled with warm lights, and disappeared inside the same abandoned warehouse she had seen before. This time she stepped closer. Through a broken window she saw Daniel sitting on the cold concrete floor, carefully wrapping his schoolbooks inside a plastic bag before placing them beneath a leaking section of the roof. Around him were nothing more than a thin blanket, an empty water bottle, 2 spare shirts folded neatly in a corner, and the photograph of his mother resting against the wall. There wasn't a bed. There wasn't electricity. There wasn't even enough food for the next day. Daniel wasn't surviving because life had been kind to him. He was surviving because he refused to quit. Mrs. Carter quietly walked away before he noticed her. She understood something important in that moment. If she approached him with pity, she would only wound the pride that had kept him fighting this long. So the next morning, she acted as though nothing had happened. A fresh lunchbox mysteriously appeared in the school refrigerator with no name attached. The librarian announced that a new education fund had covered Daniel's overdue textbooks. A bus pass arrived inside an envelope marked as an anonymous scholarship. New notebooks quietly replaced his worn ones, and every Friday, Mrs. Carter found small ways to pay him for organizing classroom materials, making sure he believed he had earned every dollar. Daniel never asked where the opportunities were coming from, but slowly his shoulders became a little lighter, his grades began climbing, and for the first time in months, hope started replacing exhaustion. Still, Mrs. Carter knew food and school supplies could never solve every problem. The greatest battle wasn't helping Daniel survive another day. It was convincing him that his future was worth believing in, and that challenge was only just beginning. Daniel's life slowly began to change, but not everyone was happy to see it. As his grades improved and he started arriving at school looking a little healthier, whispers spread through the hallways faster than the truth ever could. Some students claimed he was receiving special treatment. Others insisted he had somehow manipulated Mrs. Carter into feeling sorry for him. "Must be nice getting everything for free," one classmate muttered loudly as Daniel walked past, pretending not to hear. Another laughed and added, "Maybe we should all act homeless if that's what it takes to get extra help." Their words hurt more than Daniel admitted. He had never asked anyone for charity, yet now people believed every small step forward had been handed to him instead of earned through endless nights of hunger and hard work. The gossip eventually reached the teacher's lounge, where even some staff members questioned Mrs. Carter's decisions. "You're becoming too emotionally involved," one colleague warned. "If you keep making exceptions for one student, everyone will expect the same." The criticism didn't stop there. During a parent meeting, several parents openly complained that school resources should be reserved for students with real potential, arguing that Daniel's history of absences proved he wasn't worth the investment. Mrs. Carter listened quietly until one father declared, "You can't save every broken child." The room fell silent before she calmly replied, "No, but sometimes saving one child changes more lives than you'll ever know." Her words ended the discussion, but they didn't end the resistance. Soon afterward, the principal called her into his office and reminded her that personal involvement with students could create unnecessary complications. Although he couldn't prove she had arranged the anonymous support Daniel was receiving, his warning was clear. If complaints continued, she could face disciplinary action. For the first time, Mrs. Carter realized her kindness might cost her the career she had spent decades building. Meanwhile, Daniel remained completely unaware of the growing storm surrounding him. He simply kept studying, working, and chasing a future everyone else had already dismissed. But as pressure mounted from every direction, one difficult question remained unanswered. How much was Mrs. Carter truly willing to sacrifice before the people determined to stop her finally succeeded? Mrs. Carter knew the anonymous lunches and school supplies were only temporary solutions. Daniel's greatest obstacle was no longer hunger alone, it was time. Every afternoon he left school early to work long hours, and every exhausting shift pushed his education a little further out of reach. One evening, after watching him struggle to stay awake while solving math problems in the library, she realized that unless something changed soon, life would eventually force him to choose survival over education. She refused to let that happen. The following week, she quietly met with an old college friend who managed a local educational foundation. It wasn't a wealthy organization, and its scholarships were extremely limited, but after sharing Daniel's story and presenting his remarkable academic record, she asked for just one opportunity. When funding fell short, Mrs. Carter made a decision no one ever expected. Without telling a single person, she withdrew part of her own retirement savings to cover the remaining expenses, insisting the contribution remain completely anonymous. She never considered it charity. She considered it an investment in someone who had never stopped fighting despite having every reason to surrender. A few days later, Daniel was called into the principal's office once again. This time he expected another warning. Instead, an envelope was placed in front of him. Inside was confirmation that his tuition, books, transportation, and essential school expenses would be fully covered through graduation under a newly approved scholarship program. Daniel stared at the letter in disbelief, reading every line twice before quietly asking, "Why would someone choose me?" No one answered. Mrs. Carter simply smiled from across the hallway, pretending she knew nothing about it. That afternoon, Daniel remained alone in the empty classroom after everyone had gone home. Looking at the faded photograph of his mother, he whispered words no one else would ever hear. "I don't know who believed in me, but I won't waste this chance. One day, I'll become someone they can be proud of." From that moment forward, he studied harder than ever before, no longer driven only by survival but by purpose. He still didn't know the identity of the person quietly changing his life behind the scenes, and Mrs. Carter intended to keep it that way. Yet neither of them could imagine that this single selfless decision would one day return in a way that would leave an entire school speechless. The scholarship changed Daniel's future, but it didn't make life easy overnight. Every new opportunity came with another challenge waiting just around the corner. He graduated near the top of his class, earning admission to a respected university, yet tuition covered only part of the journey. Rent, food, books, and daily expenses still depended on his own determination. During the day he attended lectures, and at night he worked wherever he could, washing dishes in crowded restaurants, stocking shelves in grocery stores, cleaning office buildings after midnight, and spending weekends delivering packages across the city. There were countless mornings when he walked into class without having slept, silently reminding himself that temporary exhaustion was a small price for a permanent future. Not every dream unfolded smoothly. He failed important exams, lost part-time jobs, faced rejection from internship after internship, and often questioned whether success was slipping further away instead of getting closer. More than once, he stood outside his tiny rented room wondering if giving up would finally bring him peace. But every time doubt whispered that he wasn't strong enough, he reached into his wallet and looked at the faded photograph of his mother beside the scholarship letter he had carried since high school. Those two pieces of paper reminded him that someone had believed in him before he believed in himself. Instead of surrendering, he studied harder, learned new skills, accepted criticism, and slowly turned every failure into another lesson. Years passed almost unnoticed. The quiet homeless boy became a confident graduate, then an ambitious young professional whose ideas began attracting attention inside one of the country's fastest-growing companies. Promotions followed, responsibilities increased, and eventually Daniel found himself leading teams that once would never have imagined taking orders from someone with his past. Yet through every achievement, one promise remained untouched in his heart. He had never forgotten the invisible hand that had lifted him when the world had looked away, and he knew that one day, somehow, he would return to find the person who had changed his life forever. Years passed quietly, but Mrs. Evelyn Carter's life changed very little. Every morning she still arrived at school before sunrise, unlocking her classroom with the same worn key she had carried for decades. Her hair had turned almost completely silver, the fine lines around her eyes had deepened, and walking up the stairs had become slower than it used to be, yet her smile remained exactly the same. She continued greeting every student by name, encouraging those who struggled, and reminding herself that every child carried a story invisible to everyone else. Her salary had never been large, and after helping countless students over the years, her personal savings had become smaller than she ever admitted. She quietly gave up vacations, postponed repairing her aging house, and learned to live with less because somewhere along the way, putting children first had simply become part of who she was. Few people noticed those sacrifices, and she never expected them to. Sometimes, while organizing old classroom files, she would come across Daniel's name and pause for a moment. She often wondered what had become of the quiet boy with the worn shoes and determined eyes. Had he finished university? Had life been kind to him? Had he finally found the future he fought so hard to reach? She had no answers. There were no letters, no phone calls, and no visits. As the years slipped by, she convinced herself that forgetting was a natural part of growing up. She didn't feel disappointed. In fact, she hoped he had forgotten the difficult chapters of his childhood because that would mean he had found something better waiting ahead. For Mrs. Carter, that was enough. She never helped people expecting gratitude or recognition. Seeing someone build a better life had always been the only reward she needed. But unknown to her, on the other side of the country, Daniel had never forgotten a single act of kindness. Every major decision, every promotion, and every success carried one silent promise in his heart. Now, after all these years, that promise was finally about to bring him back to the place where everything had begun, and when he walked through those familiar school gates again, nothing would ever be the same. Nobody at Lincoln High expected an ordinary Tuesday morning to become the most unforgettable day in the school's history. A convoy of sleek black vehicles rolled through the front gate, instantly capturing the attention of students and teachers alike. Well-dressed men and women stepped out first, speaking quietly into earpieces before opening the rear door for a sharply dressed businessman whose confident presence seemed to command the entire courtyard without a single word. His tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and calm expression reflected years of success, yet there was something strangely familiar hidden behind his eyes. The receptionist hurried over, assuming an important donor or government official had arrived unexpectedly. "Good morning, sir. How may we help you?" she asked politely. The man smiled warmly before answering with surprising humility. "I'm here to see one teacher. Mrs. Evelyn Carter. Is she still teaching here?" Word spread through the building within minutes. Curious staff members exchanged confused glances, trying to guess why someone of his status had come looking for an aging teacher whose classroom sat quietly at the end of an old hallway. Mrs. Carter herself was called out between lessons, slightly embarrassed as she adjusted her glasses and walked toward the administration office. Standing across the room, she searched the stranger's face but couldn't recognize him. He looked at her with quiet emotion, as though holding back years of memories all at once. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the businessman reached into his briefcase and carefully placed a faded scholarship letter and an old school identification card on the desk between them. Mrs. Carter lowered her eyes, her hands beginning to tremble as she recognized the worn pieces of paper she had once signed herself. Slowly she looked back at the man standing before her. Tears gathered in her eyes before she could stop them. "Daniel," she whispered in disbelief. He smiled, his voice filled with gratitude rather than pride. "Yes, Mrs. Carter. The homeless boy everyone thought would never succeed." The room fell completely silent, but even greater surprises were still waiting, because Daniel hadn't returned simply to say thank you. Daniel looked around the silent room before taking a slow breath. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, "I spent years believing I owed you money, but the truth is, no amount of money could ever repay what you gave me. You didn't just buy school supplies or pay my fees. You gave me something far more valuable. You gave me the chance to believe my life still mattered." Tears streamed down Mrs. Carter's face as every teacher and student listened without moving. Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. "When everyone else saw a homeless boy with no future, you saw someone worth fighting for. Every success I've achieved began with one decision you made inside this school." He turned toward the administrators before signaling one of his assistants, who rolled in a large presentation board displaying architectural designs, scholarship programs, and renovation plans. Gasps echoed throughout the room. Daniel announced that his company would completely renovate the aging school, modernize every classroom, build a technology center, create a student resource hub, and establish a permanent scholarship fund for children facing financial hardship. But his biggest surprise was still waiting. At the center of every blueprint appeared one name written in bold letters, the Evelyn Carter Hope Foundation. From today forward, Daniel said with quiet pride, no child in this community will ever have to abandon an education because of poverty. Every scholarship awarded through this foundation will carry the name of the teacher who taught me that kindness can rewrite someone's entire future. Mrs. Carter covered her mouth, overwhelmed beyond words. She had spent decades believing her greatest reward was simply watching children grow, never imagining that one act of compassion would return in a way that could change thousands of lives. Daniel gently embraced the woman who had once protected his dignity when he had nothing left to protect. The applause that followed filled every hallway of the school, but Daniel knew the loudest victory wasn't the celebration around him. It was proving that one person's kindness doesn't end with the life it touches, it echoes through generations, creating opportunities for people they may never even meet. In the months that followed, the transformation reached far beyond fresh paint, new classrooms, or modern technology. Students who once believed their dreams ended where poverty began now walked through school gates carrying hope instead of fear. The Evelyn Carter Hope Foundation became more than a scholarship program, it became a promise that no child would ever be judged by worn-out clothes, an empty stomach, or a difficult past. Every year, dozens of struggling students received the opportunities Daniel had once been given, and each scholarship carried with it the story of a teacher who chose compassion over assumptions. Mrs. Carter continued teaching for a few more years, but this time she never had to wonder whether her sacrifices had mattered. Every smiling graduate, every thank you letter, and every student who refused to give up became living proof that even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples that travel farther than anyone could ever imagine. Daniel often returned to the school, not as a celebrated CEO seeking attention, but as the same humble young man who remembered what it felt like to have nothing except one person who believed in him. Whenever students asked him the secret behind his success, he never mentioned wealth, business strategies, or prestigious titles. Instead, he would quietly point toward Mrs. Carter and say, "Success begins the moment someone believes in you before the world does." Those words became the heart of the school's identity, inspiring teachers to look beyond grades and appearances, encouraging students to support one another, and reminding the community that true leadership always begins with compassion. Long after both Daniel and Mrs. Carter's names became known throughout the region, the greatest legacy they left behind wasn't a foundation, a renovated campus, or a successful company. It was a way of thinking that continued changing lives one child at a time. Because in the end, success is never measured by the size of a bank account, the title on a business card, or the number of achievements collected over a lifetime. Real success is measured by the number of lives made brighter because you chose kindness when it would have been easier to look away. And sometimes, the smallest act of compassion toward one forgotten child becomes the beginning of a future that changes generations forever.